The wind came hard off the channel and found every seam in Margaret Neilson's coat, then every seam in her skin. It salted her lips. It made her eyes water. It turned the bruise beneath her ribs into a hot, deep ache each time she breathed. She stood in the emigrant queue at Dover with her weight slightly bent to one side, not from modesty, not from habit, but because a straight posture drove pain like a nail through her flank where Lady Winford had struck her with the handle of a riding crop before breakfast. Her boots had split at the stitching 2 winters earlier, and now each plank she crossed gathered cold water inside as if she were wading, not standing. The hem of her dress stayed damp, slapped by spray and rain, and she held her cracked valise with both gloved hands because the clasp had failed and the leather bulged like a wound that would not close. Men in rough wool caps glanced at her and away again. 2 women with neat shawls looked directly at her coat, then at one another, then gave the smallest private smile. A child pointed at the valise and asked what had happened to it. No one asked what had happened to her. She kept her head lowered, dark hair pinned with strict precision at her nape, though her fingers had trembled when she fixed it in the mirrorless pantry before dawn. People in Lady Winford's drawing-room called her plain, because plain was convenient, because plain required no apology, because plain made dismissal sound like fact rather than cruelty. The morning light told another story, if one cared to see it. A narrow, pale face thinned by missed meals, large dark eyes trained downward from discipline rather than timidity, a mouth held quiet by force. Her stomach cramped in short, hard turns. She had eaten only tea leaves steeped twice and a crust left on a tray. The scent of fried fish from a nearby stall made her knees weak enough that she shifted her stance and fixed her gaze on the queue rope, one frayed thread, then the next, counting to keep from swaying. When she reached the clerk's table, the man did not look at her first. He looked over her shoulder to the dockmen who were waiting for their own amusement, then back to the paper in his hand where Lady Winford's bold signature ran across the purchase line as if she were donating to a church fund instead of removing a daughter. "1 steerage passage," he announced, voice pitched for the onlookers, "for the plain daughter." Laughter ran in a low ripple, not cruel enough to shock anyone, only cruel enough to pass for ordinary. Margaret set the valise down and passed her ticket with fingers that had gone numb from wet leather. "My name is Margaret Neilson," she said, formal and level, because her father had taught her that names were the first possession a person defended when coin and comfort were gone. The clerk stamped the paper and slid it back without apology. "If you miss first bell, Miss Neilson, your berth is released and your funds are forfeit." Funds! The word almost caught in her throat. There were no funds that had ever truly belonged to Lady Winford to forfeit. There had been Margaret's dowry account, opened by a father who kept each receipt wrapped in blue ribbon, each deposit entered in his own narrow hand. There had been timber rents from Western Fields and a London bond from her grandmother's side. There had been enough for choice, for time, perhaps for a smaller life, but one chosen by herself. Then fever took her father in 5 days. Then mourning veils were folded away too quickly. Then Lady Winford arrived with perfumed trunks, 2 laughing daughters, and a solicitor who never once met Margaret's eyes, while signatures were moved from one ledger page to another. By the time Margaret understood what had been transferred and what had been pledged, her old rooms faced inward with crates stacked to the ceiling, and she slept beneath eaves where frost filmed the inside of the glass. The queue pressed forward. A porter jostled her shoulder without looking. She bent, lifted the valise again, and breathed through the pain in her side until the black edge at the corners of her vision receded. She had worked that same discipline into her body over 3 years of little constant degradations that no guest would have noticed unless they had risen before dawn and followed her through the back stairs. She rose first, lit kitchen fires when coal had been measured meanly, copied correspondence because Lady Winford's hand tired quickly, kept debt books under strict instruction and stricter silence, and sat with ink-stained fingers at a narrow service table while laughter drifted down from rooms she had once crossed as family. She knew every account line by memory now. She knew which jewels had been quietly sold. She knew which tenancies had been renewed under altered seals. She knew that food costs had been inflated on paper, while her own supper vanished from the household ledger entirely for 6 consecutive months under the neat euphemism incidental reduction. When the sisters wanted novelty, they asked her to read aloud in Danish from her father's prayer book, so they could mimic the sounds and laugh at the shape of words they did not understand. When they wanted silence, they sent her to inventory linens in the old nursery until midnight. Twice Lady Winford withheld candles to save expense, and Margaret copied figures by embers until dawn, with her face inches from the page, smoke in her throat, numbers doubling before her eyes. At breakfast she stood behind chairs and poured coffee she was not offered. At luncheon she mended gloves too fine for her to touch, each tiny stitch invisible when finished, each hour uncounted. In the afternoon she walked to town with lists and returned with parcels, though her own boots took water and her own hands cracked from cold. She had learned to tuck bread into her sleeve when no one watched, then divide it in the attic with Martha, the scullery maid whose cough worsened in winter. She had learned which floorboards betrayed her and which did not. She had learned the exact weight of Lady Winford's gaze just before a blow. This morning that gaze had settled when Margaret asked, in measured terms, for the return of her father's ring. Lady Winford answered with the riding crop handle and a sentence spoken almost lazily, as if she were discussing weather. "You will board the Mersey today, and if you do not, I shall see you charged with theft of my household papers." Margaret had tasted blood where her teeth cut the inside of her cheek. She had said only, "Yes, Lady Winford," because defiance without witness becomes a private injury. Endurance in public becomes record. The queue crept toward the gangplank, while rain thickened into a grey sheet that blurred masts and church spires into one cold line. Somewhere beyond the harbour wall, gulls wheeled and cried. The sound reminded her of the old meadow near Neilson Hall, where her father had taught her to read tides from cloud colour and wind direction. Practical knowledge for a daughter who was meant to manage an estate one day, not vanish from it. She held his prayer book inside the valise beneath 2 dresses and a pair of stockings darned so many times they looked like maps of repair. The book was small, calfskin cracked at the spine, his initials faint in gold. She had taken nothing else from her room, because nothing else had been left that could not be called stolen by the woman now governing her address, her meals, her future. The pages smelled faintly of smoke and salt. She had pressed one sprig of dried heather between psalm leaves years ago, and had not opened to that place since the funeral. Copenhagen was written on her ticket, as if geography were answer enough for exile. Her father had been born outside that city before he came to England as a younger son with no title and sharp bookseller's eyes. He built his fortune in timber contracts and married for affection to a woman who died giving birth to a second child that did not live. Margaret was the first child, the only surviving one. She remembered his hand warm on her shoulder while he explained interest, tenancy, and debt as moral instruments, not predatory ones. Owe only what you can repay. Keep proof of every promise. Never ask another to bear a burden you are unwilling to carry yourself. Those lessons had become bitterly useful under Lady Winford's management. She had carried burdens not her own. She had copied promises she had not made. She had kept proof where she could, hidden in memory because paper could be seized. The harbour bell struck once. A boatman shouted for passengers to clear the loading path. Margaret stepped aside with the others and nearly stumbled when pain flared beneath her ribs. She steadied herself against a crate marked with shipping chalk and felt splinters bite through her damp glove. The man beside her muttered, not to her but about her, that girls sent out alone seldom fared well. She heard him. She kept her face still. By the time the packet ship Mercy rang first boarding, the rain had soaked through wool, cotton, and pride with equal efficiency. Steerage passengers surged in a tired wave toward the plank, while officers barked names and destinations over the wind. Margaret waited until an old couple ahead of her had found their footing, then moved when space opened, valise held close, ticket clamped between two fingers gone white at the knuckles. Her side throbbed. Her stomach clenched again, sharper now from the smell of tar and bilge and wet rope. A deckhand at the rail glanced at her paper, then at her face, then waved her forward as if dismissing a package. She paused at the foot of the gangplank and looked once across the harbour toward the line of England receding behind rain, not as farewell to home, but as farewell to a house that had stopped being hers, room by room, plate by plate, signature by signature. No carriage had come to see her off. No sister had offered a hand. Lady Winford had remained by her own fire, warm and perfumed, while a servant delivered the ticket and instructions as one might deliver laundry orders, paid passage, public departure, witnessed removal. Margaret set her boot on the first slick board and climbed, each step measured because her legs trembled from hunger and cold and strain. Above her, sailors hauled lines. Below her, the tide struck the pilings in hard, repetitive blows. She reached the deck, gave her name to the purser, and stood waiting in the rain while he searched a stack of documents that smelled of damp ink and sealing wax, believing with a bleak and practised certainty that England had finished with her, and that erasure, at last, had simply taken the shape of a ship. The purser kept turning pages with wet fingers, frowning each time one sheet clung to the next, and the delay left Margaret standing in the open rain, while men passed her with trunks and hat boxes that looked sturdier than her entire future. At last he lifted his chin toward a narrow strip of awning by the companionway. "Wait there, Miss Neilson. Your berth assignment has annotations." She moved as instructed, each step careful on the slick deck boards, and set her valise against a coil of rope that smelled of tar and old storms. The awning leaked at one corner. Cold water tapped her shoulder in patient intervals. From where she stood she could see the purser's table and the papers spread across it, names scored through, destinations inked in decisive black lines, seals pressed into wax by hands that had never met the bodies they displaced. She had known such papers too intimately for 3 years. She had copied them until her wrist burned. She had balanced columns while hunger made the numbers swim. She had learned that theft in a fine house seldom looked like theft. It looked like transfers, substitutions, temporary authorizations, guardianship provisions, emergency liquidations, all respectable terms marching across cream paper, while a girl who should have inherited signed as witness because refusal would have been called hysteria. Rain rattled harder against the deck-house windows, and with that hard sound came the memory of another table, oak and polished, in the small study at Neilson Hall, where her father once sat beside her with 2 ledgers open and a silver ruler laid across the page. He had smelled of cedar and ink and faint fever even then, though she had not understood it was fever at the time. "Again," he had said, tapping a line with blunt, warm fingers. "Read it aloud. Debt is not shame, Margaret. Concealed debt is shame." She had been 17, too earnest and proud of getting the sums right on the first attempt. Timber freight due at Michaelmas, payable upon delivery at Bristol, less advance already received. He had nodded. "And if anyone disputes, we produce signed receipts and weights from both docks." He smiled then, brief but real. "Keep proof of every promise. That is how small men survive large men, and how honest women survive both." The memory struck with such precision that her throat tightened against it. In the months after, when fever took him in 5 days and the house still smelled of vinegar and morning cloth, she had repeated those words while candles guttered and Lady Winford's solicitor dictated letters over her shoulder. Keep proof, keep proof. She had done what she could. She had hidden little at first, folded scraps in hems, tucked duplicate tallies beneath loose boards in the attic, but Lady Winford's daughters, Clara and Imogen, treated the house as a game board and found what they were never asked to seek. Clara held up one paper between 2 fingers, as if it were kitchen refuse. "Our poor Margaret keeps souvenirs of arithmetic." Imogen laughed and fed it to the fire with a hair ribbon Margaret had worn as a child. "Numbers are tedious. She may copy them again." That was the day Margaret learned memory had to become her safe. She trained it like a muscle. £42 transferred from Neilson dowry account to Winford household repairs that had never occurred. 12 silver pieces charged monthly for imported fruit never served below stairs. A land lease renewed under altered initials. Her mind held each figure now the way other women held melodies. Even in the rain, even with pain under her ribs and salt in her mouth, she could recite the theft-like prayer. The ship rolled gently against the moorings, and that measured sway carried her backward again, not away from pain, but deeper into its origin. Her mother had died when Margaret was 6. No portrait remained in her own room, because Lady Winford had removed it and declared the frame too cracked for display. Yet Margaret remembered the exact blue of her mother's dressing gown, and the way she sang Danish hymns on wet afternoons when the nursery fire smoked. Her father did not remarry for 11 years. People called it devotion with approving sorrow, then called it impracticality, then called it selfishness as his cough worsened and he continued to refuse London physicians. Lady Winford entered not as tempest, but as remedy, recommended by distant relations as sensible, accomplished, widowed young enough to manage a house, and old enough to manage finances. She arrived with soft speech and gloves scented faintly of rosewater. She took tea with Margaret in the blue drawing-room that first week, and asked after her reading in tones so gentle that Margaret, still thin from her first season of mourning, and eager to believe kindness possible, answered honestly, "Accountancy mostly. My father says a house is held by books as much as by stone." Lady Winford smiled without showing teeth. "Then you shall be useful to me." At the wedding breakfast, held quietly because of her father's health, Lady Winford introduced her daughters as if presenting a gift to the house itself. Clara was fair and precise, with hair like polished wheat and a laugh that carried. Imogen was softer-faced, quick to mimic her sister's expressions, and both wore dresses paid for from accounts Margaret had already started to monitor. At first the humiliations came dressed as adjustments. The housekeeper was dismissed for economy. Margaret's maid was reassigned temporarily. Her old schoolroom became Clara's morning sitting room because the light was superior. Her mother's walnut chest was moved from her chamber because Imogen required extra storage for gowns. when Margaret objected quietly and with what she still thought was reason, Lady Winford laid a gloved hand over hers and said, "You confuse sentiment with entitlement. A daughter in your position should cultivate gratitude." By the second week of November, Margaret took her meals in the steward's passage, unless summoned upstairs to pour coffee for guests who addressed her as Miss Neilson, only when they remembered she had once been presented. 2 months later, Lady Winford changed suppliers, altered household credit, and instructed Margaret to copy every new agreement in duplicate. "Your hand is neat," she said, standing behind her chair while candle smoke stung Margaret's eyes. "Do not blot. A careless line can cost a family dearly." It was nearly midnight. Margaret's knuckles had split from washing linens because 2 maids had been dismissed that morning. "May I retire when this page is complete?" she asked. "When all pages are complete." Lady Winford's tone remained mild. "You have had 1 slice of bread and tea. You are stronger than the servants. Prove useful." Clara drifted through then in silk the colour of winter roses, paused long enough to glance at the columns and said, "How fortunate for us that Margaret has no prospects. Imagine if she were distracted by courtship. We would all starve from arithmetic errors." Imogen echoed the laugh, not out of malice perhaps at first, but because echoing was easier than conscience. Margaret wrote until dawn that night, and when the first light came pale through the study glass, she flexed fingers cramped into claws and found she had copied, line for line, the instrument that transferred control of her own dowry to Lady Winford's temporary guardianship pending suitable marriage. Suitable never came. Guardianship did not end. The paper, once signed, became a gate that only rank and money could open. Margaret had neither. A crate thudded onto the deck nearby and jolted her back into the rain-bright present. A sailor cursed under his breath and dragged it past. The purser still sorted documents, lips moving as he checked names, and Margaret stood very still because stillness kept memory from spilling into her face where strangers could see it. Pain flared beneath her ribs when she drew a deeper breath. She pressed her glove there once, discreetly, and lowered her hand again. Lady Winford preferred injuries hidden. Visible marks invited explanation, hidden ones taught obedience. The bruise at her side was only this morning's account. There had been the wrist twisted in the pantry when a decanter slipped. There had been the back of Margaret's shoulder struck with a fan before guests, when she answered too slowly. There had been 3 days in January without supper, after she asked with care and proper address to review the Western Field leases in full. "You review what I place before you," Lady Winford said, rustle of silk at the doorway, lavender and coal smoke mingling in the narrow corridor. "Do not mistake your employment for authority." Employment! Margaret had almost laughed then, not from amusement, but from the bluntness of the lie. No wages were ever recorded for her, only notations that she consumed household resources disproportionate to contribution. She had found that phrase twice in annual summaries prepared for outside inspection. She had copied the phrase in her own hand, because refusal would have brought worse than hunger. Clara and Imogen learned quickly how to use their mother's language as weapon. "You are fortunate to remain here," Clara told her one afternoon, while trying on a pearl comb that had belonged to Margaret's grandmother. "Most families would place an unportioned daughter with relatives," Imogen added, adjusting gloves Margaret had mended the previous night, "or in service proper where she might earn her bread openly." The cruelty lay less in the words than in their confidence that no contradiction could touch them. They wore Margaret's ribbons to assemblies. They carried dance cards paid from accounts she reconciled. They laughed over invitations while she stood at the edge of doorways and noted expenditure totals in margins too narrow for the truth. 3 days before departure, she found the final entry that made banishment plain. 1 steerage passage to Copenhagen, charged to household contingency, purpose listed as relocation of dependent relation for domestic stability. She copied it exactly. Lady Winford watched from the hearthrug, hands folded, expression almost bored. "Sign that you entered it accurately." Margaret set down the pen. "I will sign that I copied your dictation." Lady Winford's gaze sharpened. "Do not attempt cleverness! I attempt precision." The silence that followed held a dangerous quiet. Then the riding crop lifted from the mantle, not used as lash but as handle, heavy enough in Lady Winford's hand to bruise bone through wool. "Precision, then," she said, and struck Margaret once beneath the ribs, where dress and corset would hide the darkening mark. "You depart at first bell on Thursday. Take your father's little foreign book, if it comforts you. Leave the ring." Margaret had tasted iron. She had stood upright because falling would have pleased them. "Yes, Lady Winford." That had been yesterday and a lifetime. Now the Channel wind carried tar, salt, and wet timber. England sat grey behind rain. Ahead lay a city she had never seen, and a language she knew only from prayer and lullaby. The purser finally looked up, brows raised as if surprised she had not vanished while he worked. He lifted 1 page, then another, found her name, and tapped the margin where fresh ink crossed older orders. "Miss Neilson," he called over the weather, voice formal now, almost careful. "Remain where you are. There is an amendment to your passage, entered this morning by private authority." "Remain where you are. There is an amendment to your passage, entered this morning by private authority." The purser's words had scarcely crossed the rain between them, when a crate swung loose from its rope above the foredeck, and struck the planks with a crack that made half the passengers cry out and drop where they stood. Men cursed. A child began to wail. The ship lurched against her moorings and slammed back hard enough to rattle Margaret's teeth. She did not move. She had learned too well what happened when frightened people moved without instruction in narrow places. The purser snatched the top sheet from his stack to keep it from blowing overboard, barked for a deckhand, then turned toward her with a different expression than before, less bored, less loud, as if the rain itself had become a witness. "Miss Neilson, come forward." She lifted her valise and crossed the slick boards, while elbows drove past her from both sides. Water ran down her collar and into the line of her stays. Her side burned where the bruise lay hidden. At the table, the purser held out a fresh paper with a square of red wax still tacky at one corner. "Your steerage berth is rescinded. Cabin C7, upper deck, private. Meals included." The words made no sense in the order he spoke them. "There is an error," she said. "I cannot pay for that berth." "It is paid," he tapped the signature line, "by private order." Margaret reached for the paper, and another hand reached first, gloved in black kid. Long fingers closing over the document with a calm decisiveness that did not ask permission. She looked up into rain and dark wool, and a man who seemed cut from the same weather that battered the hull, tall, broad through the shoulders even beneath a greatcoat gone nearly black with wet. Dark hair plastered back at the temples, a face severe enough to look carved. His eyes were pale and cold and intent, like winter water over stone. He scanned the page once, folded it against his palm and said, "Board now." 2 words, not loud, not repeated. The authority in them was not theatrical. It was old, practised, and accustomed to instant obedience. Margaret held his gaze one breath too long, then found her own voice by force. "Sir, that is my paper." "It is your berth," he said. "Take it." He placed the folded document in her hand, his glove brushing her wet knuckles, and signalled toward the companionway as if moving a piece on a board. Behind her the second bell clanged, sharper than the first. Sailors shouted for all non-passengers to clear. The gangplank chains began to rattle. Margaret's stomach dropped with the sound. If she lost this passage now, Lady Winford would call it refusal and prosecute at leisure. If she accepted a gift from a stranger, she entered a different kind of debt. The rain came down harder, flattening fabric to skin, blurring faces into smudged urgency. She clutched the paper and said, "Who entered the order?" The man's jaw tightened once. "Move, Miss Neilson." He knew her name. The deck pitched, sudden and vicious, and her split boot slid on algae-slick wood. Her valise lurched from her grasp, struck the rail and hung for one breath on the edge before a deckhand caught it by the handle. Margaret lunged to take it back. Pain knifed through her ribs so sharply she saw white at the margins of her sight, and would have gone to her knees if the stranger had not caught her by the elbow with swift, controlled strength, not rough, unavoidable. Heat from his hand burned through wet wool. His eyes dropped, took in the way she folded over her side, then rose to her face again with something colder than curiosity. "Can you walk?" She wanted to wrench free. She wanted not to need the answer she gave. "Yes." "Then do so." He released her at once, picked up her valise himself, as though it weighed nothing, and stepped aside for her to pass ahead of him toward the companionway ladder. Passengers pressed from behind. A woman with 2 children shoved through and nearly drove Margaret into the rail. The stranger braced one arm against a post, taking the impact in silence, creating a narrow path where no path had been. "Go," he said. She went. Down 2 steps, up another, across a pitching patch of deck where rope snapped against timber like whipcord. Rain stung her face. Tar and bilge rose in hot, bitter waves from below. At the head of the interior passage, the purser appeared again, breathless, and called past her shoulder. "Your Grace, final cargo manifest requires—" Margaret stopped. The title landed with physical force. "Your Grace." She turned despite herself. The stranger did not look at her when he answered. "Send it to my cabin." Then, as if the interruption had not occurred, he handed her valise back and held out the reassignment paper, now creased from his grip. "C7, lock the door when you enter." He did not wait for thanks. He did not ask for one. He moved toward the stern through rain and shouting men, coats snapping in the wind, while the gangplank lifted and swung away from England. Cabin C7 was no luxury by the standards of those who had always travelled dry and fed. Yet to Margaret it looked indecently generous. A narrow berth with clean ticking, a small bolted table, a peg for a cloak, a brass lamp in a gimbal, and one round window filmed with rain where grey water rose and fell like breath. She shut the door, slid the bolt, and stood still until her pulse slowed enough to feel each separate pain in her body. Her side throbbed. Her shoulders shook from cold. Her gloves clung to her fingers and would not come off at first. She set the valise on the berth, unlatched it, checked the prayer book, the dresses, the stockings, then unfolded the paper the stranger had returned. Cabin C7, upper deck, paid in full. Beneath the purser's signature sat an embossed seal she knew from legal notices and newspaper columns she had copied for Lady Winford. The ducal arms of Ashcombe, lion and shipwheel quartered beneath a coronet. The room seemed to tilt more steeply, though the sea had not changed in that instant. Ashcombe! Even in houses where kindness had gone thin, names like that carried force. Men deferred. Solicitors hurried. Doors opened. She pressed the page flat on the table with both hands, and read it again to prove the letters had not shifted. They had not. A duke had altered her passage by private order. A duke had known her name on a rain-wrecked deck. A duke had told her to lock her door, as if danger were ordinary and expected. The final departure bell clanged above her head, long and iron and final. Through the thin wall came the thud of boots and the creak of lines under strain. The Mersey pulled free. Margaret sank onto the edge of the berth, suddenly light-headed, and forced herself to breathe through nausea as the ship rolled into open chop. She had not decided what to think when Knuckles struck her door once, hard enough to carry over the storm. She froze. The bolt held. A second knock followed, then a male voice from the passage, clipped and controlled. "Open!" Fear ran cold and clean through her. She stood anyway, slid back the bolt, and opened the door a hand's width. The Duke of Ashcombe filled the narrow frame, rain still on his coat, water beading at his lashes. He had removed his gloves. His right cuff was dark, not with rain alone, but with blood that had wicked through linen near the wrist. Fresh blood, bright at the edge where the cloth shifted. Margaret's first foolish thought was that he had been shot. Her second was practical and immediate, the old reflex of attending injury before rank. "You are hurt." His gaze moved over her face, then lower to her soaked sleeves and the way her hand braced her side against the door. "So are you." "It is nothing." "Liar!" The word was quiet, almost bored and sharper for it. "May I enter?" It was phrased as question and sounded like command. Margaret stepped back because refusing a duke in his own purchased cabin corridor on a rolling ship bordered on madness. He entered, closed the door behind him, and stood without touching anything, too large for the small room, too composed for the weather outside. Up close she saw the fine white line of an old scar running from temple to jaw, almost hidden by rain-dark stubble. His face gave away very little. Not anger, not haste, only concentration directed at her as if she were a document he meant to read completely. "State your pain," he said. She stared. "My what?" "Where are you injured?" "My side." She regretted honesty at once. His eyes dropped there and lingered one beat too long. Blunt impact. Not a question. "How recent?" "This morning." He did not ask by whom. The omission felt more dangerous than inquiry. The ship pitched hard to port, throwing her against the table edge. She caught herself with a gasp. He moved one step, steadying the lamp before it swung loose, then reached into his coat and took out a folded handkerchief, already stained at one corner. "Boiling water is at the end of this passage," he said. "Fetch it." "For your wrist?" "For both injuries." "Your Grace, I am not your servant." The words left her mouth before caution could dress them. Silence held for one suspended heartbeat, filled with hull groan and rain. His expression did not harden. It became stiller. "No," he said. "You are not." He extended the blood-marked handkerchief. "You are a passenger under my protection." "Fetch the water, Miss Nielsen." The last two words were formal, precise, and left no room for retreat that did not look like panic. Margaret took the cloth. The linen was warm from his skin. "You paid my passage," she said, forcing each syllable steady. "Why?" The question hung between them while the ship climbed and dropped through black water. He answered without delay. "To remove you from Lady Winford's reach." Another roll drove rain against the porthole in a sudden sheet. He added, eyes fixed on hers. "And because no one else did." Something tightened behind her ribs that had nothing to do with the bruise. She looked away first. "That does not explain why you are aboard." "I did not offer an explanation." He shifted his right sleeve back an inch. The reopened wound at his wrist crossed an older sabre scar, jagged and pale beneath the new blood. "Water." She should have refused. Pride told her to refuse. Prudence told her to refuse anything that bound her to a duke whose name could swallow hers whole. But blood ran down his hand in measured drops and struck her floor. She set the handkerchief on the table, took the small galley kettle from the peg, and moved into the passage where sailors and stewards stumbled with trays and rope as the storm thickened. At the end of the corridor she filled the kettle from a steaming urn, wrapped her sleeve around the handle, and returned with shoulders braced against each lurch. He had not moved, not 1 inch. He stood where she left him, one hand on the berth post to counter the roll, eyes on the door as if guarding it. She set the kettle down and reached for clean linen from her valise before remembering there was none to spare. He saw the hesitation, unbuttoned his cuff with his left hand, and stripped away the ruined strip of shirt. "Use this," he said, offering the inner lining of his cravat, torn free in one swift pull. Margaret swallowed and went to work, because work was simpler than gratitude and safer than fear. She poured water into the basin, rinsed blood from his skin, pressed cloth to the wound. His jaw tightened once. He made no sound. The muscles in his forearm jumped under her fingers. At such close distance she could smell rain, wool, steel oil, and the faint medicinal scent of laudanum not recently used. "This was cut long ago," she said, before she could stop herself, tracing the old scar's edge with the cloth to avoid the deeper split. "Spain," he said, one word, offered like coin and spent at once. She tied the makeshift bandage firm. The ship heaved. Her balance went. She caught herself against his chest, palm flat to soaked broadcloth, and felt the hard, stunned thud of his heartbeat under layers of coat and waistcoat. Heat flared up her throat. She stepped back at once, mortified. "Forgive me!" "Stand still," he said. She froze. He did not reach for her. He did not step closer. His gaze had dropped to her left wrist, where her wet sleeve had slipped back, exposing finger-shaped bruises yellowing at the edges, and darker where pressure had been greatest. When he spoke, his voice was lower. "Who put those marks on you?" The question carried no gentleness. It carried intention. Margaret pulled the sleeve down with her free hand. "I fell carrying coal." "No, it is no concern of yours." "You are in my care on this vessel." "By whose consent?" Lightning flared outside, bleaching the cabin white for an instant, then plunged them back into lamp gold and shadow. His mouth twitched, not a smile, only the ghost of one at the edge of restraint. "You bargain while shaking from cold," he said. "That is either foolishness or courage." "It is arithmetic, Your Grace." Her teeth wanted to chatter. She pressed them together. "Every gift has a cost." He held her gaze so steadily that she felt stripped of every practiced defence. At last he said, "Then let us name the terms plainly. You will eat when food is sent. You will keep this door bolted. If any man other than me attempts entry, you will shout for the purser by name." He took one step back, reclaiming distance with visible effort, and reached for the latch. "In return, I will see you safely to Copenhagen unless you instruct otherwise when we make harbour." He paused with his hand on the door, rain hammering the hull, voice flat and absolute. "No one on this ship touches you without consequence." Then he opened the door and was gone into the storm-lit passage, leaving the scent of rain and iron in the small cabin, and Margaret standing beside the basin, his blood diluted pink in cooling water, her own pulse unsteady against her bruised ribs as the Mersey drove deeper into the channel. The latch clicked in its frame, and Margaret stood listening to his footsteps recede down the passage until storm noise swallowed them whole. The ship groaned. Timber answered timber. Rain struck the porthole in hard, slanting sheets. She looked down at the basin where diluted blood clouded pink, then cleared, then clouded again each time the Mercy rolled and the water shifted against enamel. Her hands shook. She pressed them flat to the table edge until they steadied. Then she crossed to the door, slid the bolt home, and leaned her brow against the wood as if the thin plank could divide one life from another. Passenger under my protection. The words rang inside her with the force of command and the weight of debt. She did not know which troubled her more. A crash sounded above, sharp enough to rattle the lamp hook. Someone shouted on deck. Another voice answered, lost in wind. Margaret flinched, then forced herself upright. He had ordered her to keep the door bolted. He had ordered her to eat when food came. He had ordered safety as if safety could be assigned. The second crash was heavier. It came with a cry that did not end cleanly. She moved to the valise by instinct and took out her father's prayer book, not for prayer but for the small packet she had hidden beneath it years ago. 2 needles, a spool of linen thread, and a narrow strip of willow bark wrapped in paper for pain when no tincture could be had. Her fingers found the items without sight. She set them on the table beside the basin, then paused with her palm over the prayer book's worn cover. Keep proof of every promise. He had taught that as accountancy. Tonight it sounded like survival. A pounding of feet came down the companionway. A steward's voice rang through the corridor, breathless and high. "Surgeon! Where is the surgeon? Get Mr. Bellamy, now!" No answer came that suggested immediate help. The ship lurched to starboard so abruptly that her shoulder struck the wall. The lamp swung wild, throwing shadows like bars across the cabin. Margaret bit back a cry, caught the table, and waited for the roll to ease. Another shout, nearer now. "He cannot move his arm. Hold him still, man. Hold him." She unbolted the door. The passage pitched beneath her boots. Men pushed past with coils of line and faces turned tight against spray blowing in from the open hatch. At the foot of the ladder to the upper deck, 2 sailors knelt around a slight figure in soaked canvas, half propped against a cargo chest. Not a child. A small, narrow-shouldered deckhand with a sparse beard and eyes squeezed shut against pain. His left arm hung at an angle no arm should hold. A splintered spar lay beside him, one broken end dark with rain and tar. "Do not move him like that," Margaret said louder than she knew she could speak. One sailor looked up, startled and irritated. "Who are you to order any—" "The shoulder is displaced," she said. "If you drag him upright, you will make it worse. Support his back. Keep his elbow close to his body." The deckhand made a strained sound between his teeth. "Please, please do not pull it." The second sailor hesitated, hands hovering uselessly over his mate. Water ran from his cap brim down his jaw. "The surgeon is below, with a lady who fainted." "Then until he comes, you listen." Margaret crouched despite the ship's heave and the immediate protest in her bruised side. "You fold that sailcloth, yes, under his neck. You tear a strip from your scarf. Quickly!" He stared as if she had spoken Greek. She met his eyes. "Now!" He obeyed. By the time the watch bell marked the next half hour, the corridor smelled of wet wool, bilge, and fear. Margaret braced one knee against the deck, took the injured man's wrist in her left hand, and counted his pulse with the old steadiness that had come from watching her father's fever rise and fall. Too fast. He was breathing in shallow catches, trying not to move. She looked at the nearest sailor. "What is his name?" "Peters. Ned Peters." "Ned!" She bent so he could hear over wind. "Look at me. You must breathe slowly. Not deep. Slow." His lashes fluttered. "Hurts like fire." "I know." She did not know, not this exact pain, but she knew enough. I'm going to bind your arm in place so the joint does not shift. I will not force it back without the surgeon." His nod was almost imperceptible. She stripped off her outer glove with her teeth, reached for the hem of her petticoat beneath her dress, and tore a long strip free. The rip sounded small against the storm. She folded the cloth twice for strength, looped it beneath his forearm, and drew it around his neck into a sling while the sailors held him steady. He groaned once, low and rough, but did not cry out. Margaret tightened the knot, checked his fingers for warmth, and touched the back of his hand. Cold, but still responsive. "Keep him sitting," she told the sailors. "Do not let him lie flat. If he grows drowsy, make him answer you. Ask his name, where he was born, what month it is." "Why month?" one asked. "Because a drifting mind answers wrong first with time." The man blinked at her, then nodded as if committing scripture. Bootsteps struck the ladder above, deliberate even in chaos. Margaret did not look up. She reached for the kettle a steward had dropped, found it still half warm, and poured a little water over a clean corner of cloth to wipe grit from Peters's scraped temple. Superficial cut, no heavy bleeding, thank God for small mercies granted without ceremony. A shadow fell across them. The sailors straightened reflexively. "Report," said the Duke of Ashcombe. "Loose spar, Your Grace," one sailor answered. "Caught Peters on the shoulder. Miss here fixed him up till surgeon comes." Margaret tied off the final knot and only then lifted her gaze. He stood one step down from the hatch, bareheaded now, dark hair wet against his forehead, greatcoat unbuttoned as if he had come in haste. Rain tracked along the line of his jaw. His eyes moved from Peters to the improvised sling to Margaret's torn hem, and bare hand pressed against the injured man's sleeve. His right cuff showed fresh seepage through the bandage she had set. He had reopened it again. "Why are you out of your cabin?" he asked. The tone was flat. The question was not. "Because he needed help." She nodded toward Peters without rising. "And because your surgeon was occupied." "Miss Nielsen," he said, each syllable precise, "I gave you clear instructions." "And he was in pain." For one suspended beat she thought he might order her below in front of the crew and settle the matter as hierarchy required. Instead he crouched on the opposite side of Peters with the controlled economy of a man familiar with unstable ground. "Peters," he said, voice carrying through wind without force, "can you move your fingers?" Peters obeyed, wincing. "Aye, Your Grace." "Good." The Duke looked to Margaret again. "Any sign of head injury beyond the temple?" "No unequal pupils. No vomiting. He answers to name and date." "You assessed pupils in this light?" "I moved the lamp close." His gaze flicked to the swinging lantern above, then back to her face. Not approval, not surprise. Something narrower and harder to name. "Mr. Hales," he said to the nearest sailor, "send for Bellamy again. Tell him Ashcombe requires him now." "Aye, Your Grace." Hales ran. Peters swallowed painfully. "Beg pardon, sir. I should have tied the spar." "You should heal," Ashcombe said. "Leave fault to me." The words landed like iron dropped on stone. Margaret saw Peters's shoulders loosen a fraction despite pain. Another violent roll hit the ship broadside. The hatch banged. A crate slid 3 feet and struck the bulkhead. Men shouted above. Glass shattered somewhere aft. Margaret threw one arm across Peters to keep him from toppling. The Duke's hand shot out at the same instant, bracing both man and crate with brutal strength. His bandaged wrist hit timber. He hissed once under his breath and withdrew. Blood spotted the deck between his boots. Margaret caught the movement and felt anger rise, swift and irrational. "You have torn it open again." His eyes cut to hers. "Attend to Peters." "You are bleeding onto my work." For a moment, in the storm-streaked lantern light, his mouth shifted at one corner. Not quite a smile. Gone before she could trust she had seen it. "Then issue your orders, Miss Neilson," he said. She nearly answered that she had no right to order a duke. Instead, she heard her father's voice in memory, and Lady Winford's, and the years between them that had taught her where silence preserved dignity and where it destroyed it. She pointed at the sailor, remaining beside them. "You! Tear another strip from that sailcloth and hand it to me. Your Grace, press here," she indicated the inside of his wrist with 2 fingers, "firmly. If you faint, I shall be furious." The sailor made a strangled sound that might have been laughter if fear had not strangled it first. Ashcombe did not react, beyond shifting his thumb to the wound exactly where she directed. "As commanded," he said. Mr. Bellamy arrived then, grey-haired and rumpled, medical case banging against his knee. He took in scene and hierarchy in one practised sweep. "Your Grace, Miss." "Shoulder displacement," Margaret said before anyone else could speak. "Sling in place. Pulse rapid." He remained conscious. Bellamy knelt by Peters and tested the arm with gentle, expert hands. "Well done, whoever set this. Better than most deck improvisations." His eyes flicked up. "You, miss?" Margaret nodded once. "Stay, then. I may need an extra pair of steady hands." Ashcombe straightened to full height. "You have them." Bellamy hesitated, perhaps uncertain whether the Duke meant himself or Margaret. The answer came when Ashcombe stepped behind Peters to support him for reduction and said, "Proceed." What followed was brief and precise and ugly only in sound. Peters cried out once when the joints slipped back into place, then sagged against Ashcombe's chest, panting. Bellamy rebound the sling properly, checked circulation, and dosed him with measured laudanum. "He will keep the arm still 3 weeks," the surgeon said. "Longer, if he values future use. No climbing. No hauling." Peters gave a weak, disbelieving laugh. "On a ship? Then he values pain, and pain will instruct him." Bellamy looked toward Margaret again. "You chose correctly not to force the reduction without me." Margaret inclined her head. Praise felt foreign, like a borrowed shawl that fit but did not belong. 2 sailors lifted Peters carefully and carried him toward the infirmary berth below. The corridor thinned as urgency moved elsewhere. Rain still hammered. The Mersey still fought the sea. Yet the narrow pocket of crisis around them loosened enough for silence to reappear. Margaret rose too quickly. The deck tilted. Black flecks swam at the edges of her vision. A hand closed around her elbow before she could fall. "Steady," Ashcombe said. She could feel heat through wet sleeves where his grip held her upright, exact and brief. When her balance returned, he released her at once. Formal distance resumed like a drawn blade. Bellamy snapped his case shut and looked between them, physician's eyes missing little. "Your Grace, your bandage has failed again." "Oh, I am aware. You will not be useful to anyone if that wrist opens further." "I am aware of that as well." Bellamy gave Margaret a pointed glance. "Miss Neilson appears to have better compliance from you than I do." "Do not be insolent, Bellamy. Then do not bleed on my deck." The surgeon's tone stayed dry, almost deferential, and not at all yielding. "Cabin, both of you. I shall come when I have settled Peters." He left before either could object. Margaret drew a careful breath and immediately regretted it as pain flared under her ribs. Ashcombe saw the flinch. His gaze dropped, hard and assessing. "You are done here," he said. "So are you." His eyes returned to hers. "Is that defiance?" "It is triage." He looked at her for a long moment while the ship groaned around them. She became acutely aware of rainwater trickling down her spine, of torn cloth clinging to her calf, of her ungloved hand reddened from cold and work. The Duke of Ashcombe, who had commanded sailors and surgeon in 2 words each, stood motionless in a flooded corridor and said nothing at all. Then, "Come." 1 word, not harsh, unarguable. He turned toward her cabin passage rather than his own, walking at her pace without comment each time the ship rolled, and she reached for the bulkhead. At her door he waited while she slid the bolt back and entered first. Only when she faced him from inside did he step over the threshold. He closed the door behind him against the storm and set his back to it for 1 heartbeat, eyes shut, as if holding the sea outside by will alone. When he opened them again, they were colder than before and far more tired. She gestured to the chair by the bolted table. "Sit." He obeyed. The obedience startled her more than any command had. She set fresh water to warm over the small spirit lamp, laid out cloth, thread, and willow bark in clean order, and went to his wrist with the practised economy of someone too exhausted for embarrassment. The old scar crossed the new split, like 2 histories colliding. She cleaned it in silence. He watched her hands, not her face. At last he said, "You disobeyed me." "Yes." "You might have been hurt." "So might Peters." He drew 1 breath slow, as if containing temper and something else more dangerous than temper. "You do not calculate your own safety." She tied the bandage firm, meeting his gaze only when knot and pressure were secure. "I calculate outcomes. He needed hands immediately. Yours needed binding after. These were sequential facts, not heroics." His jaw shifted. "Heroics. If you call it that, you may dismiss it. I prefer accuracy." Rain drove against the porthole. The lamp flame bent, recovered, bent again. Somewhere above them, the watch changed, boots crossing in quick succession overhead. The world narrowed to wool, linen, salt, and the unsteady rhythm of 2 people who had no settled language for what had just passed between them. She reached for the willow bark strip, broke a small piece, and held it out. "For pain! Bitter! Chew slowly." He took it, fingers brushing hers once. "You carry that in your valise?" "I carry what prevents collapse." His eyes moved to the prayer book near the basin, then back to her face. "And what preserves dignity?" The question struck with quiet force. Margaret wrapped the bloodied cloth for washing, buying a breath before answering. "Work done properly. Records kept. Names spoken correctly." "A severe creed." "It has kept me alive." He did not answer at once. He placed the willow bark on his tongue, expression unreadable, even as bitterness must have hit. Then he said very softly, "Tonight it kept more than that." A knock came before she could respond. 3 short raps, Bellamy's rhythm. Ashcombe rose immediately, composure settling back over him like armour. Margaret opened the door. The surgeon entered, inspected the fresh bandage with a grunt of approval, checked her side with professional briskness when he saw her guarded posture, and pronounced the bruise deep but not dangerous if she rested and accepted the broth now waiting in the galley queue. "I will send it here," Bellamy said, "and bread. Both of you will eat." Ashcombe gave a minimal nod that, in another man, might have been surrender. Bellamy departed again into wind and duty. Margaret moved to rebolt the door. Her hand paused on the metal. She turned. The Duke stood beside the table, tall enough that the cabin seemed built for smaller species, his wet hair now drying in uneven dark waves, his repaired wrist held still at his side. He looked not like a rescuer or tyrant in that moment, only like a man carrying weight he had not chosen and had never learned to set down. "Miss Neilson," he said. She waited. "When I told you no one would touch you without consequence, that was not theatre." "I did not take it for theatre." "Good." He held her gaze with that same winter steadiness that had met her on the rain-lashed deck. "Add this to your terms, then. If you choose to act, you do not act alone." Something tightened in her throat. Not fear, not relief. A harder thing forged where distrust and gratitude met and neither yielded. "I make no promise to stand idle," she said. "I ask no such promise." A pause. "Only warning." The ship rolled again. He set one hand on the table to steady himself and did not move toward the door. She realized with a small, startling certainty that he was waiting for her assent as he had waited for her answer at the gangplank, for her hands at his wound, for her judgment in the corridor while a man cried out in pain. Command lived in him. So did restraint, jagged and deliberate. "Very well," she said. "Warning when possible." His head inclined once. Agreement entered as quietly as breath. He stepped to the door, opened it to a corridor still loud with storm, then looked back over his shoulder. Rain light and lamplight cut his face into planes of shadow and pale scar. "Bolt it," he said. He did not wait to see if she obeyed. She heard his boots recede, measured despite the ship's pitch, until distance and weather took them. Margaret slid the bolt into place, set her forehead against the wood once more, and let herself feel for 3 bare heartbeats the tremor she had denied in front of sailors and surgeons and dukes alike. Then she straightened, carried the bloodied cloth to the basin, and began to wash it clean while the Mersey drove on through black water and wind. She rinsed the cloth until the water ran clear, then wrung it with both hands and hung it from the peg beside her damp cloak. The cabin smelled of iron and spirits and wet wool. The storm did not lessen. It pressed against the porthole in long grey strikes, then in sudden fists of rain that made the brass frame shudder. A soft knock came, careful this time, almost apologetic. Margaret slid the bolt and opened the door a narrow span. A galley boy stood there with a tray balanced against his hip, no older than 16, hair plastered to his brow, eyes wide from too much weather and too many orders. Broth sloshed in a tin bowl. 2 heel-thick slices of bread sat beside it, wrapped in cloth to keep them warm. "From Mr. Bellamy, miss," he said, "and by order of his grace." She took the tray. "Thank you." He lingered 1 heartbeat. "He told us to knock twice and wait for your answer. For this cabin only." The words settled in her chest like a weight with 2 names, caution and care. She gave a short nod, and he ran back down the passage before another roll threw him against the wall. She bolted the door again and set the tray on the table. Steam lifted from the broth in thin, wavering lines. Her stomach clenched at the scent, painful and eager at once. She sat, lifted the spoon, and forced herself to swallow slowly. The first mouthful burned, the second stayed down. By the fourth, the shaking in her fingers eased enough that she could hold the bowl without spilling. Outside, the ship struck a heavier swell and dropped. The lamp swung. Broth leapt over the rim and scalded her knuckles. She hissed and set the bowl down. Somewhere above, men shouted in clipped bursts. A block snapped against mast with a sharp report. Then boots hammered past her door, fast and purposeful. She stood before she knew she was moving. "No," she told herself, warning when possible, not reckless motion into other people's danger, because she could not bear to sit still. She stayed where she was and counted 10 breaths. On the 11th, another sound came from the passage, not boots, a hand against wood. Then 1 hard knock. She opened the door at once. The Duke of Ashcombe stood in the threshold, one shoulder braced to the frame as the vessel rolled, rain and spray silvering his coat. His face had gone paler under weather-dark skin, the old scar at his temple stark in lamplight. His bandaged wrist was red through the linen again, though less than before. Behind him, 2 sailors hauled a lashed trunk down the corridor, cursing as another wave pitched them sideways. "Take your valise," he said. "Now!" She tightened her grip on the door. "Why?" "Because this section may flood if the next seam gives way. Bellamy wants the starboard upper cabins cleared. Mine is above the line. Move!" The command carried no drama. It carried logistics and urgency and a refusal to debate risk while timber groaned around them. Margaret turned, took her valise and prayer book, and came back. He stepped aside to let her pass first, one arm out to steady her as the deck rose beneath them and dropped again. They moved 3 doors down, then up a narrow ladder where wind shoved cold spray through every crack. He kept pace with her without touching, unless the ship threw her off balance, and each time his hand came to her elbow, it left immediately once her footing returned. His cabin was larger, though still spare by great house standards. A wider berth bolted to the wall, a fixed desk with raised edges, 2 sea chests strapped in place, a brass compass mounted beside charts weighted with a pistol and an inkstone. A second lamp burned lower, throwing amber light across paper and polished wood. The air held cedar, damp leather, and the faint medicinal sharpness she now associated with him. "Inside," he said. "Bolt it." She entered. He followed and threw the bolt himself, testing it once with his palm before turning back to her. Only then did she see what lay on the desk. Not correspondence, not military orders. Ledgers, 3 stitched account books, the cheap kind purchased for household records, water-warped at the corners but protected beneath oilcloth. Beside them sat folded sheets sealed and resealed, margins filled with annotations in a hand she recognized with visceral certainty, because she had watched it alter her life one signature at a time, Lady Winford's hand. Margaret did not move toward the desk. She did not trust her knees to bear it if she did. Ashcombe followed her gaze and said nothing for several breaths. The ship listed. Lamp flame bent and recovered. A line snapped somewhere high above and was answered by shouted orders from deck. At last he spoke. "Sit!" "I would rather stand." "Sit anyway. You are near collapse." The words were blunt, almost harsh and undeniably accurate. She sat on the edge of the fixed chair, valise between her boots, prayer book clutched too tightly in one hand. He remained standing, one hand on the desk rail to counter the sea. He did not pace. He did not perform calm. He was calm, and she saw how much effort that composure cost him in the way his jaw tightened when the wrist pain flared. "You were not sent away for economy," he said. "You were removed to prevent testimony." The cabin seemed to narrow around her. "How long?" she asked. "Have you had those books?" "Parts of them, 8 months. Complete copies, 11 days. "From whom?" "From 2 men your stepmother dismissed without references. 1 clerk she underpaid. 1 groom who can read better than she knew. Rain hammered the hull in a long, flattening rush." Margaret set the prayer book on her lap because her fingers had gone numb. "You had no right," she said quietly, "to investigate my household without my consent." "No." His eyes stayed on her face, not on the ledgers. "I had cause." "What cause?" he answered without looking away. "Your name vanished from 3 county filings where it should have appeared. Your dowry trust shifted twice without court review. A dead instrument bearing your witness signature appeared in London with ink that did not match the date. And 6 weeks ago in your own village, Lady Winford struck you on the church path in front of 4 people who pretended not to see." Margaret felt the words physically, each one a separate blow and a separate rescue. She had not known that moment on the path had reached beyond hedge and gossip. She had not known anyone with power had been watching. "Why?" she said. Why involve yourself at all?" He gave a short breath that was not quite a laugh and had no amusement in it. "Because predation dressed as guardianship is still predation. That is principle, not reason." His mouth set in a hard line. "My reason is not subject for this hour." The refusal should have angered her. Instead, it left a sharp, strange ache beneath her ribs, close to the bruise and harder to classify. She stood abruptly and crossed to the desk before caution could pull her back. He did not stop her. She opened the top ledger. Her own handwriting stared up at her from page after page, neat and disciplined, each figure entered as dictated, each lie preserved because refusal had carried its own penalties. But now, in the margins, another hand had marked discrepancies in thin, slanted strokes, transferred without authority, duplicate charge, false valuation, coercive witness likely. On one page, beside incidental reduction, someone had written in dark ink, "Food withheld from dependent relation. Corroborate with servant's testimony." Margaret closed the book with care, both palms flat on the cover. "You read everything," she said. "Ah, yes." "Even the private household notations." "Yes." The next roll threw her sideways. She caught the desk edge. He moved in a single step and steadied her by the shoulders, firm and controlled, then released when she found her balance. His gaze dropped to her wrist, where the cuff had ridden back again, revealing the fading finger marks she had lied about twice already. He spoke in the same calm tone he might have used to read weather. "Do not lie to me about injury again." She lifted her chin. "You command too easily." "I learned command where hesitation killed men. This is not a battlefield." "No." The word came low and absolute. "This is worse. In battle, violence is named." The sentence hung between them, irreversible, once spoken. She could not unhear it. He could not unsay it. By the time the next bell rang above deck, muted through rain and timber, the cabin had grown warmer from lamp and bodies and the sealed door. Yet Margaret could not stop shivering. Exhaustion had moved from her limbs into her bones. She sank back into the chair without deciding to sit. Ashcombe took the bowl from the tray she had carried in, found it still half full, and held it out. "Drink." She looked at him, at the Duke in a storm-dark coat, with blood at his cuff and legal evidence spread across his desk, offering broth as if nourishment were a matter of military order. "I am not one of your sailors," she said. "No," he said, "they obey faster." Against her will, a sound escaped her that might once have been laughter before years taught her to mute it. It vanished quickly, but she saw his eyes change, just briefly, as if some locked mechanism had shifted one notch. She took the bowl and drank. He moved to the door and stood with his back to it, one hand resting just beneath the bolt, not guarding the room from her, guarding it for her. The posture was unmistakable once seen. He remained there through 2 violent rolls and one shuddering impact that made the charts jump on the desk. He did not sit. He did not speak unless practical necessity required it. When a knock sounded, 2 quick strikes and a pause, he answered first. "Name." "Hails, your grace. Seam held." "Bellamy asks if Miss Neilson requires laudanum." Ashcombe looked to Margaret. "No laudanum," she said. "I need a clear head." He turned to the door. "You heard her. Return to station." Bootsteps retreated. The stillness after was not peace. It was compressed weather. Margaret set the empty bowl down and pressed her fingers to the bridge of her nose. Her thoughts moved too quickly and too slowly together. Ledgers, witnesses, 8 months, church path, removed to prevent testimony. "You paid my passage to send me beyond legal reach," she said, not looking up. "Yes." "And boarded the same vessel?" "Yes." "Why?" He was silent long enough that she thought he would refuse again. Then he said, "Because distance is useful. Absence is not." She lowered her hand. He continued, voice even, each word chosen with visible care. "If I had remained ashore, Winford's solicitor could claim I manipulated records in your absence. If I travelled with you, every action could be documented in the ship's log and witnessed by crew, purser, and surgeon. Protection requires structure, not sentiment." There it was again. Principle fitted to process, care hidden inside administrative architecture so that no one could call it weakness. Margaret stared at the floorboards. "You built a legal corridor around me and called it passage." "Yes." The ship slammed down off a swell. Lamp glass rattled in its frame. Instinct drove her to brace, but pain in her side caught, and she folded forward with a sharp inhale she could not hide. He crossed the space immediately, crouched once at eye level, and said, "Where?" "Ribs. Same place." "Can you breathe fully?" "Not deeply." He stood, took a folded blanket from the berth and wrapped it around her shoulders without ceremony, tucking one edge in so it would not slip when the vessel rolled. His knuckles brushed the line of her collarbone, brief and accidental and electric in a way that made her skin tighten under wet fabric. "Do not apologize for pain," he said. She had not realized she was about to. The words undid something small and stubborn in her chest. She looked up, and he was too close now, close enough that she could see the fatigue etched beneath his eyes and the tiny tremor in his injured hand when he thought she was not watching. "You are bleeding again," she whispered. "It can wait." "It should not. It will." The refusal was not arrogance. It was triage again, his version of it. She could not argue with the mirror of her own logic. Minutes passed, or an hour. Time on a storm ship dissolved into impacts, bells, and breath. Margaret's head grew heavy. She fought it, straightened, blinked hard. The blanket warmed her damp dress. The cabin's swing became almost rhythmic. "Sleep," he said. "I will not sleep while you stand there." "I have stood longer in worse weather." "That is not an answer." "It is the only one you received tonight." She should have resisted. Instead, she leaned back against the bulkhead beside the desk, prayer book in her lap, and told herself she would close her eyes for 1 minute only, no more. When she woke, grey dawn had begun to dilute the porthole glass. The storm had not ended, but its violence had ebbed to heavy rain and long swells. Her neck ached. Her legs were cramped beneath the blanket. She did not at first understand why her right hand felt warm. Then she looked down. At some point in sleep, the ship had rolled and slid her across the narrow space until her shoulder rested against Ashcombe's knee, where he sat on the deck beside the door, back to the timber, injured wrist bound in fresh linen. Her hand, still curled from cold, lay against the broad plane of his uninjured forearm. He had not moved her away. He had not moved at all. His eyes were open, fixed on the bolted door as if it were an adversary to be held at bay, by vigilance, alone. Stubble darkened his jaw. His coat was still damp at the hem. A clock fixed above the chart rail ticked with merciless steadiness, and she saw then that 6-hour marks had passed since midnight watch. He had stayed there the entire night so she could sleep. As if sensing the change in her breathing, he turned his head and looked at her fully for the first time since dawn light entered the room. His voice, when he spoke, was low and rough from silence. "You are covered in bruises," he said. "You are not leaving because you wished to leave." He held her gaze, and the next words landed with the force of oath. "Stay where I can protect you." Margaret drew her hand back from his sleeve and sat up, slowly, blanket slipping to her waist. Dawn made him look harsher, the planes of his face cut in grey and salt light. but his eyes did not move from hers. The ship creaked. Rain tapped the porthole in gentler strokes now. She could hear men above speaking in ordinary voices again, the storm spent to labour. "I will stay," she said, each word measured, "but not as a ward, not as a burden shifted from one ledger to another." He held still. "As what, then?" he asked. "As the lawful heir to my father's estate, as the injured party whose testimony is her own. If I return with you, it is as an equal in purpose." A long beat passed. Then he inclined his head once, the motion formal as treaty. "Agreed." By noon the clouds had lifted enough to reveal a pale line of coast through mist, and the Mersey rode a long, tired swell toward harbour, while ropes dried stiff along the rail. Margaret stood wrapped in her mended shawl on the lee side of the deck, her cracked valise at her feet, her father's prayer book held under one arm against spray. The Duke stood beside her, bareheaded, gloved again, right wrist freshly bound under a clean cuff. Neither spoke until the chalk cliffs sharpened from ghost to stone. He handed her a folded packet sealed in dark green wax. "Read." Inside lay 3 affidavits, each signed and witnessed. The dismissed clerk detailing falsified transfers. The groom attesting to Lady Winford's order that Margaret be sent away before quarter accounts were inspected. Mr. Bellamy's medical statement naming visible bruising and probable blunt force injury observed aboard. Beneath them sat a certified copy of the purser's log entry, recording her passage reassignment, his own boarding time and weather delays that proved sequence beyond dispute. "You anticipated challenge to chronology," she said. "I anticipate every challenge." She turned the last page. Her own upgrade receipt, lion and shipwheel clear in the embossing, had been attached with thread. "And this?" "Physical chain. It ties her ticket to my intervention and to ship witnesses." He paused, looking not at the papers but at the shoreline ahead. "Your original steerage ticket is with Bellamy. Dry, intact. It will be produced." A gull wheeled low over the mast, white against a clearing sky. Margaret replaced each sheet with careful fingers. "The ring," she said quietly. "My father's signet. She kept it." Ashcombe's jaw shifted. "If it is in that house, it will be inventoried before dusk." At Dover, the dock was mud, rope, and shouted inventory, familiar and changed at once. Word travelled faster than boots when Rank disembarked. By the time Margaret stepped down the gangplank beside Ashcombe, 2 county constables waited under the customs awning with an officer from the magistrate's office, hat brim beaded with rain. The ticket clerk who had mocked her stood at his high table, saw her, and went very still. The magistrate's officer bowed first to the Duke, then to Margaret. "Miss Nielsen, we received your Grace's dispatch by cutter at first light. Writs are prepared for execution at Winford Hall, pending your sworn statement." "Taken now," Ashcombe said. "In public," Margaret added. The officer glanced between them, then nodded. "As you wish." They used the customs room because it had dry walls and 3 witnesses who could write. Margaret gave her account standing, hands flat on scarred oak. She named dates, sums, signatures, withheld meals, forced labour, injuries. She did not rush. She did not soften verbs. When she finished, she placed her hand on her father's prayer book and swore to truth in English, and then in the Danish she had not spoken aloud in years. The room stayed silent after her final word. The ticket clerk cleared his throat. "Miss Nielsen, about the remark on embarkation day, She looked at him once. "You spoke what was convenient. Record what is accurate now." He bowed his head and signed as witness without another syllable. Rain began again as they reached Winford Hall, thin and cold, making the gravel drive shine like slate. The house loomed exactly as she had left it, and smaller than memory. Too many windows, too little warmth. Servants lined the entry under pretence of work. Martha stood near the back with flour on her apron, and tears she wiped away before they fell. Lady Winford entered the drawing-room in plum silk with lavender at her throat, and outrage already arranged on her face. Clara and Imogen followed in travelling gowns trimmed with unnecessary ribbon, both pale when they saw who stood beside Margaret. "This is an intrusion," Lady Winford said. "Your Grace, whatever grievance this girl has embroidered—" "Silence," said Ashcombe. The single word struck the room flat. Mr. Penrick, Ashcombe's solicitor, opened the first ledger on the centre table. Constables took position at each door. Margaret stood opposite her stepmother with the prayer book in one hand and the affidavit packet in the other, her bruised side tight under stays but steady. Penrick read entries aloud in an even voice: dowry diversions, duplicate charges, unauthorised guardianship extensions, false household reductions. He placed each supporting statement beside the corresponding line, then set down Mr. Bellamy's medical note and the purser's certified log. He finished by producing Margaret's original steerage ticket, still marked with Lady Winford's purchase signature, and the upgraded receipt bearing Ashcombe's seal. Lady Winford laughed once, brittle and high. "Household reallocations, entirely legal." "Not with forged witness dates," Penrick replied. He slid forward a page with ink analysis notation from London. "Not with coerced testimony, not with assault corroborated by independent medical record." Clara made a small choking sound. Imogen gripped the back of a chair until her knuckles blanched. Martha stared at the carpet and said barely above a whisper, "I saw the riding crop this week in the morning room." Penrick turned to her. "Will you swear that before magistrate?" Martha lifted her chin. "I will." Lady Winford rounded on Margaret then, silk rustling like dry leaves. "You ungrateful! After all I have provided—" Margaret did not raise her voice. "You provided hunger, concealment, and fear." "You charged me for my own erasure." The constable captain stepped forward and read the warrant. "Fraud, battery, coercive transfer of protected assets." Lady Winford tried to pull away when he touched her sleeve, but another constable had already taken position. There was no struggle worth naming, only the abrupt end of her certainty as she was escorted through the hall she had ruled by volume and perfume. Her lavender scent lingered after the door closed behind her. Clara sank into a chair and covered her face. Imogen looked at Margaret with a baffled, almost childlike terror and said, "Will they send us away?" Margaret answered without cruelty, "That depends on what you knew and what you signed. You will have rooms until inquiry is complete. Nothing more." Before sunset, inventory officers worked through drawers and strong boxes, while Penrick recorded each item in duplicate. In Lady Winford's locked escritoire they found the signet ring wrapped in a handkerchief, along with 2 unsent letters instructing a Copenhagen agent to confirm Margaret's arrival and report if she sought return passage. Penrick added both letters to evidence and read their contents aloud in front of witnesses. External contact resolved, intent established. When he placed the ring in Margaret's palm, she closed her fingers around it so tightly that the metal pressed a crescent into skin. She did not cry. She slid it onto a ribbon and tied it beneath her collar, against her pulse. 3 days later, under a clear October sky, Margaret signed the county estate register in the magistrate's chamber, with Ashcombe and Penrick as witnesses, Martha present by her request. The room smelled of sealing wax and old paper. Her hand trembled once on the first stroke, then steadied. "Margaret Ann Nielsen," she wrote, each letter clean. The registrar sanded the ink and nodded. "Heir restored. Interim stewardship returned to named principal. Ashcombe placed a second document beside it. Your household appointments drafted from your recommendations. She scanned the list. Martha retained as housekeeper with wages doubled and medical stipend guaranteed. 2 dismissed staff invited back at fair terms. Accounts to be audited quarterly by independent clerk. Her mouth tightened on a breath that was almost disbelief. You drafted this last night, she said. I drafted the framework. The names are yours. She looked up. You kept your word about structure, he answered simply. So did you. The chapel stood on a low rise beyond ash trees, stone damp from morning mist, windows clear enough to spill pale light over worn flagstones. It was quiet by design, no ballroom audience, no spectacle to convert tenderness into gossip. By special license and her explicit terms filed in writing, they married with 6 witnesses: Penrick, Bellamy, Martha, 2 old estate servants, and the parish rector who spoke each vow as if law and mercy might share the same breath. When asked her consent, Margaret met Ashcombe's winter eyes and gave it in a voice that carried to the back wall. When asked his, he did not hesitate. After, there was no feast beyond warm bread, broth, and tea in the rectory room, and no music beyond rain beginning again against chapel glass. Ashcombe stood beside her at the small register table while she signed her new name with the same controlled hand that had copied false ledgers in hunger and now wrote truth in open light. He did not cover her hand. He set his beside it on the page, palm down, still, close enough for warmth, far enough for choice. England remained grey beyond the window, wet fields and stone and law and memory, but it was no longer a place she had been paid to leave.